Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Mishna Yud Aleph. The Mishnah says, Taram mina Demai ala Demai, mi Demai avadai teruma v'yachzor v'yitrom. If someone separated teruma, which in this case is terumat ma'asel, from Demai that he bought from one amaretz, for Demai that he bought from another amaretz, mi Demai ala vadai, or he separated teruma from Demai, for definite tevel, teruma. In both cases, whatever you separated, we treat as teruma, because it's possible that both batches were equally chayav, and then the teruma that you separated was effective. However, you have to separate teruma again, because it's also possible that the demai you separated as terumat masel was already tied, while the demai which you separated for was not tied, so the teruma that you took did not take effect, and the produce is still tevel. So you have to give the piece that you separated to the kohen as terumat maser. However, in order to eat the other batch, the vadai or the other demai, you have to separate from it terumot masot again. Now, even though you have to separate terumot masot again, whatever you separated, like we said, we treat as terumat maaser, and it's given to the kohen. The kohen does not have to tithe it; he can eat it straight, because again, since the demai that you separated this terumah from was the rabbanan, anyways, the Torah does not obligate it to have terumot masot removed. The chachamim were lenient, and they allowed the kohen to have it. However, mina vadai ala demai, if you separate terumat ma'asel from definite tevel for demai, teruma, we treat whatever you separate as teruma, because it's possible that the demai was not tied, and therefore they have the same obligation. But in this case, since whatever you separated from is biblically obligated, if the demai that you separated for was really tied, so this piece of teruma that you took from the vadai portion still considered tevel. The teruma that you took out didn't take effect, and in that case the kohen would be eating vadai tevel, and that's asur. Therefore, in this case, lo te'achel ad shotzi aleh terumot masrot. Even though the kohen was given that piece as teruma, he's not allowed to eat it until the owner takes out terumot masrot for it. That is the Rabotai of Perek Mishnah Yud Aleph. Perek Vav now discusses the obligations of someone who farms a field as a sharecropper or as a tenant farmer. We're going to Terumot Masrot. Just as a background, we're going to explain a aris, a sharecropper, is someone who rents land to farm, and he agrees to pay the owner a percentage of the crop, which the Rab tells us usually is a half, a third, or a quarter of the crop, depending on different factors. A tenant farmer, a chocher, he also rents land to farm, but instead of giving a percentage of the crop, he pays the owner a fixed amount of produce. So the Mishnah says, "Hamikabel sadeh miYisrael min haoved kochavim umin hakuti." Someone who receives a field as a sharecropper from a Jew or a goy or avodat oved kochavim or a kuti, yechalek lifnehem. He's allowed to divide the produce in front of them, which means, the Rav explains, you can give the landowner his share of the crop without first separating terumot masrot from it. That's more lenient, because imagine I had to separate terumah and myself from my field, and only afterwards give the portion over to the landowner. I'd have less produce. So the Chachamim were lenient in this case. The Rav explains they wanted to make sure that the land of Eretz Yisrael would remain cultivated. The problem is like this: if sharecroppers had to tie the crop before they give the landowner his share, it might possibly discourage people from leasing fields as sharecroppers. Then it's going to leave farmland in Eretz Yisrael uncultivated. So to prevent this, Chachamim were lenient. They say a sharecropper can give the landowner his share as tevel, and he doesn't have to tithe it before he gives it. However, a chocher sadeh miYisrael, someone who rents a field as a tenant farmer from a Jew, meaning he's giving a fixed amount of produce, torem v'noten lo, he has to separate terumah from the crop, and only then he gives the landowner his share. He doesn't have to separate the other tithes before giving the landowner his share, but he has to separate terumah. Terumah, and the Mepharshim explain why. Because terumah is supposed to be separated from the crop while it is still on the threshing floor. In contrast to in the contract of the tenant farmer, the chocher, it requires him to give the landowner his share after the crop has been removed from the threshing floor. So in this case, the Chachamim left the obligation to separate terumah from the crop with the chocher, because it's still in his possession. However, by the case of the sharecropper, the aris, they leave aside the owner's share before removing it from the threshing floor. Therefore, the Chachamim did not require him to leave over anything. But in the case of the chochel, since teruma is separated while it's still on the threshing floor, and they would only give the produce after they finish threshing it, and their obligation remains to give over the teruma. Now, the tenant farmer, the chochel, is not obligated to separate the cost of the teruma. The cost of the teruma falls on the landowner. Meaning, the Rav tells us that the tenant farmer subtracts the amount he separates as teruma from the amount he pays the landowner. And also, the Chachamim did not require this chochel to separate the other tithes, again, for the leniency of wanting to have the land in Eretz Yisrael remain cultivated. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, again, he's not arguing ematai. Rabbi Yehuda says ematai when he's qualifying the previous statement. When do we say that the chochel doesn't have to separate the other tithes? Bizman shenatan lo me'ota sadeh u'me'ota amin. That's when he gave the landowner his share from the produce of the same field that he rented and from the same species of produce that they agreed he would plant. Now, the tenant farmer, the chochel, he pays the landowner, like we said, a fixed amount of produce, not a percentage of the crop. Therefore, the produce that he gives them doesn't have to be from the actual field. However, in order to have this leniency of not having to separate the other tithes, it has to be from the same produce of that field that you rented and the same species. If he gave him his share of produce from the produce of a different field, even though it's from the same species, or he gave him produce from a different species, even though it's from the same field that he rented. For example, they agreed that he was going to plant wheat on the field, but he planted barley on part of the field, and the landowner agreed to accept the barley as payment. He has to separate all the tithes and then give the landowner his share. And because in this case, the landowner, he only agrees to accept tevet as his share when the chochel grew the kind of produce he originally agreed to plant. However, in this case, what happened? The chochel decided to give him from other produce or from another field. In this case, the chochel has to separate not only teruma but all the other tithes, and on top of that, he has to bear the cost, meaning he has to give the landowner his full share in tithe produce, and he's not allowed to subtract it from the amount that the landowner receives. Next Mishar, we're going to discuss about a chochel, a person who's a tenant farmer of a non-Jew. That is today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.